Sawyer was 71, a retired high school history teacher from a small town near the river. His life had always been quiet and steady, mornings spent in the garden tending to his tomatoes, afternoons in the sunroom with a book and a cup of tea. But a few months ago, something changed. He began waking up more tired than he'd gone to bed, with a strange heaviness in his legs and a dull ache in his lower back. At first, he blamed it on age or perhaps too much yard work. It wasn't until he nearly fainted while helping his grandson fix a bike that his daughter insisted on taking him to the doctor. I still remember the look in Sawyer's eyes when the test results came in. The doctor spoke gently but firmly. His kidney function had dropped far lower than it should be for his age. "You might not have felt it coming," the doctor said, "but your kidneys have been working much harder than they should for a long time." Sawyer sat there in stunned silence, hearing words like chronic kidney disease and monitoring. But all he could think about was how something so important could be slipping away without warning. I could see the fear in his face, not just for himself, but for the thought of leaving his wife alone sooner than expected. As a doctor, I've seen many moments like this, when a person realizes their body has been carrying a hidden burden for years. But Sawyer's case struck me in a personal way. He wasn't careless, he didn't drink, didn't smoke, kept active, and even watched his salt. Yet, like so many others, he didn't know that certain foods could slowly wear down kidney function, while others could give those small but vital organs the support they desperately needed. He thought he was doing everything right, but his diet held quiet culprits that were making things worse. We sat together in my office that afternoon, the sunlight spilling through the blinds, and I told him there was still hope. The kidneys, though delicate, have a resilience that surprises even the most seasoned doctors when given the right environment to heal. Small changes, choosing the right fruits, oils, and vegetables, could help his kidneys rest and recover. Sawyer listened carefully, his brow furrowed, but there was a spark in his eyes. This wasn't just about medicine, it was about reclaiming his life before the disease took more than it already had. Over the next few weeks, Sawyer began his quiet transformation. He swapped out a few foods that were quietly straining his kidneys and brought in others that nourished them. At first it felt strange, letting go of familiar flavors and routines, but soon he noticed subtle shifts. The morning fatigue began to lift, that heaviness in his back eased. His skin looked brighter and his appetite returned. Even his wife remarked that his laughter was back in the house, softer but more frequent. When I see Sawyer now walking through the clinic doors with a small basket of blueberries or a bottle of extra virgin olive oil to show me, I see a man who has learned to listen to his body in a way he never had before. His journey isn't about fear anymore, it's about care, intention, and a kind of respect for the parts of himself that quietly keep him alive. And it's this journey, the foods that helped, the ones he avoids, and the small steps that brought him back from the edge, that I want to share with you today, because if it can help Sawyer, it might just help you or someone you love. The first change came on a Sunday morning in late March. Sawyer had risen before dawn, the way he always did, intending to make coffee and sit by the window with the paper. But as he stood at the kitchen counter, the room tilted ever so slightly and a wave of weakness ran through his legs. He leaned hard on the counter, the hum of the refrigerator loud in his ears. It passed quickly, but it left him uneasy. His wife, Marianne, noticed his pale face and asked if he'd skipped breakfast again. He didn't answer right away. The truth was, food had lost its appeal these past few weeks, and he'd been skipping meals without realizing how much it was draining him. Later that morning, he agreed to take a short walk to the corner store. It was something they'd done together for years, a small, familiar ritual. But halfway there, he stopped. His legs felt heavy, his chest tight, and his breath came quicker than it should. He brushed it off with a joke about needing younger legs, but Marianne's brow stayed furrowed all the way home. That evening, she set a small bowl of blueberries in front of him after dinner. "Doctor says they're good for your kidneys," she said simply, "and you've been looking tired." He stared at them for a moment, their deep blue skins glistening under the kitchen light. He'd never thought about what a handful of berries could do for his body. It seemed too simple, too ordinary. But that night, for the first time in weeks, he slept through until morning without waking. It might have been coincidence, or maybe just the comfort of being cared for, but it planted a quiet thought in his mind. Perhaps there were smaller, gentler ways to help himself than he'd imagined. A few days later, Sawyer found himself in my office again, not because of an emergency, but because Marianne had insisted on a follow-up. She sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes flicking to me as if to say, "Please make him listen." We talked about his latest lab results, the slow climb in his blood pressure, and the strain it was placing on his kidneys. I could see him nodding, polite and attentive, but there was still that quiet resistance, the kind that comes from not wanting to admit something is serious. Before he left, I handed him a small mesh bag of fresh garlic bulbs. "Don't just keep these for flavor," I told him. "Think of them as a way to take the pressure off your kidneys." He chuckled, saying he'd never been much for garlic unless it was in spaghetti sauce. But Marianne tucked them into her bag like a precious gift. The next morning, Sawyer came into the kitchen to find her mincing fresh garlic into a spoonful of olive oil. She told him she was making a dressing for their salad and that she'd leave the garlic raw, just as I'd suggested. He wrinkled his nose at the sharp scent, but when lunchtime came, he surprised himself by enjoying the mellow heat it brought to the greens. Over the next week, Marianne found little ways to slip garlic into soups, roasted vegetables, even mashed potatoes. Sawyer didn't realize it then, but something subtle began to shift. His morning fog lightened, his hands felt steadier, and there was less of that uncomfortable swelling in his ankles. One evening, as they cleaned up after dinner, he caught sight of the garlic bulbs on the counter and felt a quiet sense of gratitude. It wasn't dramatic, there were no sudden miracles, but he was starting to believe that small, deliberate choices, the kind he used to dismiss, might hold more power than he'd given them credit for. It was a chilly Thursday when Marianne decided to make her mother's old cabbage soup recipe. The smell filled the kitchen by late afternoon, a mix of sweet vegetables and the earthy scent of simmering broth. Sawyer sat at the table, watching her slice the pale green leaves into neat ribbons. He remembered how, as a boy, he'd pushed cabbage to the edge of his plate, convinced it was bland and unnecessary. Now, the thought of a warm, gentle soup felt oddly comforting. When we spoke earlier that week, I'd told him cabbage was one of the few vegetables both nourishing and safe for kidneys that struggled with potassium. I'd explained in my quiet way that its compounds could help soothe inflammation, though I avoided the heavy medical jargon. He didn't say much at the time, but I could tell he filed it away. As the soup simmered, he leaned over the pot and noticed how the colors deepened, the greens softening, the broth taking on a golden tint. They ate together that night, the steam curling up from their bowls. Sawyer noticed how light it felt in his stomach, how it warmed him without leaving him sluggish. Over the next few days, Marianne kept a pot in the fridge, and he found himself ladling some out for lunch without thinking. It was strange, he'd never been one for healthy eating trends, but there was something deeply satisfying about this simple cabbage soup. It didn't demand anything of him, didn't feel like a chore. By the end of the week, he realized he hadn't had that tight, bloated feeling in his belly that used to make him loosen his belt after dinner. The change wasn't just in his body, it was in his mood. He began to look forward to the meals, not just for the taste, but for the quiet ritual they were building together. And for the first time in years, he caught himself thinking that maybe food could be a form of care, not just fuel. The change happened on a Saturday morning grocery run. Sawyer had wandered into the oil aisle while Marianne compared prices on bread. Rows of bottles stretched before him, clear, green, gold, but one in particular caught his eye. A dark glass bottle labeled extra virgin olive oil, cold pressed. He remembered me mentioning it during his last visit, how it could ease inflammation in a way that gave the kidneys a break. The price was higher than the vegetable oil he usually bought, but something about the rich, dark bottle made him want to try. Back home, Marianne suggested they use it for their evening salad. The first pour surprised him. The oil was thicker, almost velvety, and carried a faint, peppery aroma. They drizzled it over slices of tomato and cucumber, added a pinch of sea salt, and shared the plate while talking about their plans for the week. There was no lecture, no diet plan, just the quiet enjoyment of a new taste. Sawyer found himself savoring each bite, noticing how the olive oil coated his tongue with warmth instead of greasiness. Over the next days, they began using it in more dishes, brushed lightly over roasted vegetables, stirred into pasta, even swirled into a bowl of warm soup. Sawyer was surprised to find that his hands didn't feel as stiff in the mornings, and that persistent dull ache near his lower back was easing. He couldn't prove it was the oil, but the connection was enough to keep him reaching for the bottle. One evening, as he watched Marianne drizzle olive oil over a pan of fresh bread, he realized something else had shifted. This wasn't just about adding a new ingredient, it was about replacing old habits with ones that felt intentional, almost protective. In that moment, he understood that healing didn't have to be loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was as quiet as a slow pour of golden oil over warm food. It was a warm afternoon when Sawyer's grandson, Ethan, came over after school, clutching a paper bag from the local fruit shop. "Grandma said you'd like this," the boy announced, pulling out a small golden pineapple with a tuft of green leaves. Sawyer laughed, remembering the last time he'd eaten pineapple at a summer barbecue years ago when it had been grilled and glazed until nearly candied. This one, though, smelled fresh and sharp, like sunshine in his hands. Marianne cut it open right there at the kitchen counter, the knife sliding easily through the tender flesh. She offered him a wedge, its juice already running down her fingers. Sawyer hesitated, thinking of the old warnings about tropical fruits being too high in potassium. But I had told him that pineapple was different, gentle on the kidneys with an enzyme that could help calm inflammation. So he took a bite. The sweetness was immediate, but it was the brightness that surprised him, a tang that seemed to wake him up from the inside. They sat together, passing slices back and forth, sticky fingers and all. For a moment, it didn't feel like a kidney health decision. It just felt like a treat, a small joy tucked into the day. That night, he noticed he moved more easily when getting up from his chair, the usual stiffness in his lower back less insistent. Over the next week, pineapple became a quiet ritual. Marianne would cut a few pieces in the morning, setting them in a bowl beside his tea. Some days he'd eat it slowly, savoring each bite. Other days he'd finish it before the tea had cooled. Either way, it became a reminder that healing didn't always have to feel medicinal. Sometimes it could be as simple as a bright fruit on a sunny afternoon, shared with someone who cared enough to bring it home. The rain had been steady all day, tapping against the kitchen windows and filling the house with the soft scent of damp earth. Marianne suggested roasting vegetables for dinner, something warm and filling. Sawyer hovered nearby as she peeled the papery skins off a pile of red onions, their deep color catching the light. He'd always thought of onions as just another base for soups or sauces, not something worth noticing on their own. But when she sliced them into thick rings and tossed them with olive oil, the sweet, sharp aroma began to fill the air. As they roasted, the onions softened and curled at the edges, turning a glossy, caramelized brown. Sawyer speared one onto his fork at the table, half expecting the usual sharp bite, but instead found a mellow sweetness that lingered on his tongue. I had once mentioned that onions, especially red ones, carried compounds that could help ease blood pressure and protect those small, tireless blood vessels in the kidneys. He hadn't thought much of it then, until now, tasting something both comforting and quietly purposeful. They ate slowly, the rain still tapping in the background, talking about nothing urgent, the neighbor's new dog, a book Marianne was reading, the smell of wet leaves outside. Later that night, as he climbed the stairs to bed, Sawyer noticed he wasn't short of breath the way he usually was after a heavy meal. It was a small difference, but it felt like a promise. In the days that followed, onions began appearing in more of their meals, tucked into sandwiches, scattered over salads, sautéed beside the morning eggs. Sawyer found himself looking forward to their gentle sweetness, even feeling a little proud that something so simple could be a quiet ally in his recovery. And somewhere in those small, roasted slices, he began to sense that his kitchen had become more than just a place to eat. It was becoming part of his healing. It started as a simple suggestion from Marianne on a crisp autumn morning. The air was cool, the leaves along the river path had begun to turn amber, and she handed Sawyer a small, shiny red apple before they stepped out the door. "Eat this while we walk," she said, her tone casual but knowing. He turned it in his hand, remembering how apples had always been the safe, unremarkable fruit in the bowl, neither a treat nor a chore. But that morning, with the sun just breaking through the clouds, it felt different. They walked slowly, side by side, the gravel crunching under their shoes. Each bite of the apple was crisp and refreshing, the sweetness balanced by a faint tartness. I'd told him before that apples carried pectin, a kind of fiber that could help the body in quiet, invisible ways, even easing some of the strain on the kidneys. But in that moment, Sawyer wasn't thinking about science. He was thinking about how the juice ran cool across his tongue and how the simple act of walking with Marianne felt lighter than it had in months. Halfway through the path, they stopped at a bench to watch the river flow past. Sawyer finished the last bite of the apple, core and all but the seeds, and realized he wasn't as winded as usual. The stiffness in his legs felt less stubborn, and there was a quiet energy humming under his skin. Marianne noticed too, in the way he sat straighter, the color in his cheeks, and she smiled without saying a word. Over the following weeks, these apple walks became part of their rhythm. Sometimes they'd take the longer route, sometimes just around the block, but always with an apple in hand. It wasn't about chasing dramatic change, it was about building small, steady habits that nourished him without feeling like work. And with every walk, Sawyer began to feel not just his kidneys growing stronger, but his life expanding again, step by careful step. The turning point came one Sunday morning at the diner on Main Street. Sawyer and Marianne had been meeting old friends there for years, always ordering the same hearty breakfast: scrambled eggs, toast, and a side of crispy bacon. The smell of it filled the place as soon as they walked in, rich and smoky, wrapping around him like a familiar comfort. But that morning, something in him hesitated. He remembered our last conversation, the quiet way I'd explained how processed meats, with their heavy salt and additives, made the kidneys work harder than they should. When the waitress came, he surprised himself by asking for fresh fruit instead of bacon. His friends teased him lightly, saying he was going healthy now, but Sawyer just smiled. The plate arrived without the familiar strips, and for a moment he felt a pang of loss. But as he ate, he realized the meal felt lighter, leaving him without that sluggish weight he'd grown used to after breakfast. Marianne noticed too, her eyes warm across the table. The real change came later that day, when he walked to the park without needing to stop and catch his breath. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to make him wonder how many of those quiet burdens he'd been carrying without knowing. That night, he and Marianne went through the fridge together, setting aside the ham, the deli meats, and the leftover sausages from last week's dinner. It wasn't about never tasting them again, it was about choosing when and how rarely they would find their way back to his plate. In that small act, Sawyer felt something shift. Letting go of the bacon wasn't just about the salt or the phosphorus, it was about saying goodbye to habits that had followed him for decades without question. And for the first time, the absence didn't feel like loss, it felt like space. Space for something better, kinder, and gentler on the body that had carried him this far. It was late afternoon when Sawyer found himself standing in the kitchen, staring at the small glass jar of salt that had sat on the counter for as long as he could remember. It had been there through decades of family meals, Sunday roasts, and quiet weekday dinners, always within reach, always an afterthought. But lately, he'd started noticing how often his hand drifted toward it without thinking. Marianne, who had been slicing tomatoes at the counter, glanced over and said softly, "Maybe we put that away for a while." He didn't argue. Instead, he picked up the jar, feeling its familiar weight, and set it high on the top shelf, out of sight. That evening, they cooked without it, letting herbs, garlic, and a drizzle of olive oil carry the flavor. At first, the food tasted different, almost muted, but after a few bites, he began to notice subtler notes: the sweetness of roasted carrots, the slight peppery edge of cabbage, the warmth of onions. Without the blanket of salt, the food felt more alive. Within a week, Sawyer noticed something else. The swelling in his fingers had eased, and the tightness in his shoes was gone. He didn't feel as thirsty all the time, and the heaviness that had crept into his afternoons seemed to lift. Marianne caught him one evening, tasting a spoonful of soup and smiling in quiet surprise. "It's good," he admitted, "even without the salt." From then on, the salt stayed on that top shelf, only coming down when absolutely necessary. It wasn't a punishment, it was a choice. A small, deliberate act of care, the kind that didn't feel dramatic until he realized just how much lighter his body felt living without it. In that simple shift, Sawyer learned that sometimes healing starts not with what you add, but with what you gently set aside. One warm afternoon, Sawyer stopped by the small convenience store near the park. It was habit. He'd done it for years after his walks, picking up a cold can of soda as a little treat. The fizz, the sweetness, the sharp bite against his tongue. It had been part of his routine for as long as he could remember. But that day, as he stood in front of the fridge, the rows of colorful cans suddenly felt different. He remembered our talk about how sodas, both regular and diet, made the kidneys work harder, quietly wearing them down over time. The thought stayed with him, heavier than the heat outside. Instead of soda, he reached for a bottle of cold water. At first, it felt like a small defeat. Water couldn't give him that same rush of flavor. But as he walked back toward the park, sipping slowly, he realized how refreshing it felt without leaving that sticky sweetness on his teeth. Marianne noticed the change later that evening when he reached for water at dinner instead of the soda bottle in the fridge. She didn't say much, just smiled as she passed him a glass filled with ice. Days turned into weeks, and the sodas stayed on the store shelves. He found himself sleeping more soundly, waking with less dryness in his mouth, and even his afternoon fatigue began to ease. There was a new lightness in his step during their walks, something he hadn't felt in years. And though he still thought fondly of the sound of a can popping open, the craving had dulled, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of knowing he was making a choice his kidneys would thank him for. One evening, as he sat on the porch with Marianne, watching the last of the light fade over the trees, he realized it wasn't just about giving something up. It was about making space for better things. The soda had been part of his comfort, but now that comfort came from somewhere deeper, in the slow and steady return of his energy, and the quiet pride of keeping a promise to himself. Sawyer's journey began with quiet, almost invisible struggles, a heaviness in his legs, a lingering fatigue, and the unsettling news that his kidneys were working far harder than they should. What started as small, hesitant steps soon became a pattern of care. He learned to welcome simple foods like blueberries, garlic, and cabbage into his days, not as chores or restrictions, but as quiet allies. At the same time, he let go of old habits, the bacon at breakfast, the salt jar within arm's reach, the familiar fizz of soda, each choice creating more space for his body to rest and recover. These changes didn't come with overnight miracles. They arrived slowly, almost unnoticed at first, an easier climb up the stairs, a walk that felt lighter, a night's sleep without waking. What made the difference wasn't just the food itself, but the mindset that grew alongside it. The understanding that caring for his kidneys wasn't about grand gestures, but about steady, gentle acts repeated day after day. Looking at Sawyer now, you can see the shift not just in his health, but in his presence. There's a steadiness in his step, a deeper color in his cheeks, and a quiet pride in knowing he's made choices that will carry him further. His story is a reminder that it's never too late to listen to your body, to honor it with what you give and what you take away. So if you've been putting off that first step, start small. One change, one habit, one mindful choice. You may be surprised at how those quiet decisions can transform not just your health, but the way you feel in your own life. And remember, your body has been carrying you for years. It's time to return the favor, gently, patiently, and with hope.